I still remember the sound of the clock ticking that morning. Slow, heavy, almost cruel. The lawyer's office smelled faintly of coffee and old paper, and the air felt wrong. My hands wouldn't stop trembling, no matter how tightly I folded them in my lap. To my left sat my son, Daniel. Quiet, distant, his phone screen reflecting on his blank face. To my right, my daughter, Alicia, whispered something to her husband and let out a soft laugh. A laugh at her father's will reading. My stomach twisted. I tried to tell myself they were just nervous, but deep down, something in me already knew. Something was about to break. The lawyer, Mr. Henson, cleared his throat. He was a kind man once, or maybe I just wanted to believe he still was. "Thank you all for coming," he began, his voice calm and rehearsed. "We're here today to read the last will and testament of Mr. Charles Warren." The room went silent. Even the air conditioner seemed to hold its breath. I braced myself, ready to hear the life I built being summarized in neat legal sentences. Ready to hear about the house I cleaned, the business I supported, the debts I endured, all for the man I thought I knew better than anyone. He started with small details first. Donations, old friends, things that didn't matter much. I waited, smiling faintly at the name of his college roommate, a man I'd never met but heard stories about. I even smiled when they mentioned his antique watch collection. He'd spent years searching for those pieces. But then, when Mr. Henson looked down again, adjusting his glasses, I saw it. His expression changed. His voice grew careful. "To my wife," he said, pausing longer than necessary, "I leave nothing." For a second, I thought I misheard. The words didn't make sense, like they were floating in from someone else's story. Nothing. I blinked, waiting for him to correct himself. But he didn't. He kept reading, his voice slicing through the silence. Around me, I heard gasps, my sister-in-law's sharp inhale, the faint murmur of a cousin. Then laughter muffled behind a hand. I turned toward the sound, and that's when I saw my husband's brother, Harold, leaning back in his chair with that smug little grin he always wore when life handed him a gift he didn't deserve. My throat burned. "There must be some mistake," I whispered. Mr. Henson didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me, really looked at me, with eyes that said he'd been dreading this moment. "I'm sorry, Mrs. Warren. This is the document your husband signed." He lifted the will slightly as if to prove its weight. I reached out for the paper, my fingers trembling. And there it was, my husband's signature at the bottom of the page. Except it wasn't. The loops in his handwriting were too neat, too steady. My husband's hand had trembled for years after the accident. He couldn't have written that perfectly. I felt my cheeks flush hot. Behind me, someone whispered, "Maybe he knew what she did." I froze. What I did? I turned, scanning faces, trying to find the mouth that said it. But they all looked away. My own children avoided my gaze. Alicia's hands were folded tightly in her lap, knuckles white, her jaw set. Daniel's head hung low. That hurt more than the will itself. The silence of my children. The silence that said they already knew. I forced a smile, even as my heart cracked. "That's impossible," I said softly. "My husband would never leave me with nothing." Harold chuckled under his breath. "He warned us this would happen," he said, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Said you'd act surprised." My vision blurred. I stood up too quickly, my chair scraping the floor. "You're lying," I snapped. "All of you." He loved me. But my voice broke before I could finish. The lawyer looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with his pen. "Mrs. Warren, please," he said gently. "Let me finish reading." But I could barely hear him. My pulse was pounding too loud in my ears. My husband, the man I'd bathed when he was too weak to move, the man I'd defended against his own family's whispers, had supposedly left me nothing. The humiliation settled over me like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. Every pair of eyes in that room was on me, dissecting me, judging me, and then something strange happened. As I looked down again at that document, I noticed the corner of another sheet tucked beneath it. Barely visible, but there, the edge of a second page. My heart skipped. "Is that all?" I asked. Mr. Henson hesitated. "There's one more page," he said quietly. But before he could continue, Alicia suddenly stood up, knocking her chair backward. "Stop!" she screamed, her voice slicing through the room. Everyone froze. Her hands were shaking, her face pale as if she'd seen a ghost. "Don't read it," she said, her voice cracking. For a moment, no one moved. Then Harold's smile faded. Daniel looked terrified. And I couldn't breathe. Why would my daughter, my own flesh and blood, want to stop the lawyer from reading her father's final words? I stared at her, my heart breaking and racing at once. Alicia, I whispered. What are you doing? But she didn't look at me. Her eyes were fixed on the paper in Mr. Henson's hand. I saw fear there, not sadness, not grief, fear. The lawyer frowned. Miss Warren, please sit down, but she shook her head violently. You can't read that page, she cried. He didn't mean for her to hear it. The room erupted into chaos, voices overlapping, gasps, murmurs. I stood there frozen, every word cutting deeper into the wound that had just opened inside me. My son tried to grab her arm, whispering something urgently, but she pushed him away. And that's when I knew. Whatever was on that last page, my children knew it too. The lawyer hesitated, his hand trembling over the document. I stepped closer, my voice low but shaking. Read it. But before he could turn the page, my daughter screamed again, louder this time. Stop reading it! And in that moment, everything I thought I knew about my family began to unravel. When everyone left that day, the house didn't feel like home anymore. It felt hollow, like the walls themselves were listening, whispering things I didn't want to hear. The laughter that once filled it was gone, replaced by a silence that made my skin crawl. My children stopped coming by, not even a call to ask how I was. And when I passed our neighbors, I could feel their eyes on me, their whispers brushing against my back. They didn't say it out loud, but I knew what they were thinking. She must have done something to deserve it. I tried to hold my head high, to act like it didn't matter. But at night, when the lights were off, I'd sit in my husband's chair, holding his old coffee mug, and the tears would come anyway. I kept asking myself why. Why would a man who once held my face in his hands and called me his entire world erase me from it completely? Every memory twisted into doubt. Every promise sounded like a lie. And worst of all, my own children believed the story that I was unworthy of even a line in their father's will. But when shame turns to pain, pain turns to anger. And soon I wasn't crying anymore. I was searching. It started small. I opened the drawers he used to keep locked, the ones I was told never to touch. I told myself I was just looking for comfort. Something to remind me that the man I loved still existed somewhere behind that betrayal. But instead I found something that made my hands go cold. Inside one of the folders labeled house repairs, there was a loose paper, a loan document with my husband's signature at the bottom. Only, it wasn't his handwriting. The loops in the C of his name were off. The pressure of the pen too heavy. My husband's hand had trembled for years. This was too smooth, too precise. I stared at it for a long time. My heart raced, but my mind whispered, no, it can't be. Maybe I was imagining things. Maybe grief was twisting my logic. But deep down, a seed of suspicion took root. And once it does, it never lets go. The next day, I found myself in his old study, digging through boxes of files, receipts, old letters, anything that might make sense of the chaos. The dust stung my eyes, and the air smelled faintly of his cologne, fading but still there, like a ghost refusing to leave. Every drawer I opened felt like a betrayal being unearthed. And then I found the second clue. It was a bank statement, dated just a few months before he died. A joint account, but not with me. My husband's name was linked to his brother's. I stared at the balance, large, far larger than anything we ever discussed. That money wasn't part of our family finances. I would have known. I should have known. My knees nearly gave out. I sat there on the floor, the papers spread around me like a crime scene. Because that's what it felt like in a crime. My marriage, my trust, my life, all stolen quietly, with forged ink and silent greed. Later that evening, I called Daniel. I wanted to believe my son would understand, that he'd hear the tremor in my voice and come home. Daniel, I whispered into the phone, I found something strange about your father's accounts. There was a pause on the other end. Then his voice, cold and detached. Mom, maybe you should just let it go. Let it go? Those words shattered something inside me. Let it go? I repeated, my voice rising. He left me nothing, Daniel. Don't you want to know why? He sighed. Dad had his reasons. You just have to accept that. And then he hung up. That's when I realized it. They were all in on something. Or at least they knew more than they were saying. For days, I barely ate. I walked through that house like a stranger, touching things I'd once loved, the curtains we picked together, the cracked photo frame on the mantel. Everything felt staged now, like a performance I'd been excluded from. I could almost hear Harold's voice in my head. He warned us this would happen. But what warning? And why did my daughter try to stop the lawyer from reading the last page? The questions haunted me until one night, while rummaging through a cabinet I'd avoided for years, I found it. A small envelope, yellowed at the edges, tucked behind an old book of family photos. My name was written on the front in my husband's familiar, shaky handwriting. Underneath it, the words, "To be opened only if you still believe in me." My hands trembled. For a moment, I just stared at it, afraid of what was inside. What if it proved I was wrong about everything? Or worse, what if it confirmed my worst fears? I sat down at the kitchen table, the one where we used to share morning coffee, and slowly opened the envelope. Inside was a single folded note. His handwriting, faint and fragile, ran across the page. "My love," it began. "If you're reading this, then I know the truth has already begun to surface. I couldn't protect you from them while I was alive. But maybe I still can." My heart pounded in my chest. I read it again, slower this time. "Protect you from them." Who was them? His brother? My children? The people I trusted most? And then I noticed something else inside the envelope, small and metallic. I tipped it over and a single key fell into my palm. Tied to it was a small scrap of paper with a date written in his unmistakable scrawl. 1 week after his death. I stared at that date until the numbers blurred through my tears. Whatever this key opened, whatever my husband had hidden, it was meant for me, but only after he was gone. And in that moment, I realized something that chilled me to the bone. My husband's betrayal might not have been what it seemed. Maybe the will wasn't the final word. Maybe. It was the beginning of a secret he left behind. My pulse quickened as I held the key tightly in my fist. I didn't know what it unlocked or what I would find. But one thing was certain: this house, this family, this story, was built entirely on lies, and I was finally ready to tear it down. But what I didn't know then was that the truth waiting behind that key would destroy the last bit of innocence I had left. Because inside that envelope was a single key, and a date written in his handwriting, 1 week after his death. I couldn't sleep after finding that key. Every night it sat on my bedside table, glinting under the lamp like it was watching me. I'd wake up at 3 a.m., staring at it, wondering what it guarded. My husband had been gone only a few weeks, and yet he was still finding ways to haunt me, even from the grave. I kept replaying the words on that note in my mind. If you still believe in me. Believe in what? In the man who left me with nothing? Or in the man who might have been trying to tell me something the rest of the world wanted hidden? On the date written beside the key, I dressed carefully. Not because I cared how I looked, but because I needed armor. Grief had already stripped me bare. I needed something to hold me together. I went to the lawyer's office, my hands clutching the key inside my purse. He looked different that day, nervous, jumpy. His smile didn't reach his eyes. When he saw me, his shoulders dropped, as if he had been dreading this moment. He said softly, "He told me you'd come, exactly 1 week after." His voice broke slightly on the word told. I frowned. "My husband?" I asked. The lawyer nodded, swallowing hard. "He left something for you. Something I wasn't allowed to give anyone else." Then, without another word, he reached into his desk and slid a thick, sealed envelope across the polished wood. My name was written in my husband's handwriting again, shaky, fragile, but unmistakably his. My throat tightened as I picked it up. "Did he tell you what's inside?" I asked. The lawyer's gaze darted to the door before whispering, "He said it might destroy everything you thought you knew, and that once you open it, you can't pretend anymore." His words made my chest tighten. I nodded slowly, thanked him, and walked out, the envelope heavy in my trembling hands. I didn't open it right away. I drove to a quiet park near the courthouse, parked under a tree, and sat there for what felt like hours. The paper felt warm, almost alive, as if it was pulsing with secrets. Finally, I tore it open. Inside was a single photograph. My breath caught in my throat. It was him, my husband, younger, smiling, standing beside a woman I had never seen before. She was holding a baby, and his hand was on her shoulder. For a long time, I couldn't breathe. My mind tried to reason, to explain. Maybe it was a business associate, a cousin. But no, the way he was looking at her. The tenderness in his eyes. It was the look he used to give me before the lies began. I flipped the photo over. There was a date scrawled on the back, 30 years ago. The same year I'd had my first miscarriage. 1,000 memories crashed over me at once. The nights he came home late, smelling faintly of another perfume. The sudden trips for work. The quiet sadness in his eyes that I used to mistake for guilt. Now I knew what it was, remorse. I clutched the photo until the edges bent. "Who are you?" I whispered to the woman in the picture, my tears splattering onto her face. That night I couldn't eat. I couldn't think straight. Every sound in the house made me jump. I kept the photo in my lap like it might answer me if I stared long enough. But all it did was taunt me with silence. The next morning, I decided I had to know. I started calling hospitals, the ones he'd worked with, the ones near where the photo was dated. I used his name, pretending to be an old family contact. Most of them brushed me off, saying they couldn't share private information. But a few gave hesitant answers, too hesitant, as if they recognized the name and didn't want to get involved. By the end of the day, I had a list of addresses, places my husband had visited around that time. Old neighborhoods, clinics, apartments, each one was a dead end. People either didn't remember him or pretended not to. And then one evening my phone rang. An unfamiliar number. I answered, half hoping it was one of my children finally calling. But the voice on the other end was low, whispery, almost urgent. "Stop digging into what's buried." I froze. "Who is this?" I asked, my voice shaking. The line crackled, then went dead. I stood there, staring at the phone, my heart pounding in my ears. Whoever that was, they knew. They knew I was looking, and they wanted me to stop. But fear has a strange effect when you've already lost everything. It stops controlling you. I wasn't afraid anymore. I was angry. I went back to the lawyer the next morning. His assistant tried to turn me away, but I insisted. When he finally came out to meet me, his eyes darted around nervously again. "You shouldn't be here," he said. I slammed the photo onto his desk. "You knew about this, didn't you?" "Who is she?" He flinched. For a moment, I saw real fear in his eyes. "Mrs. Reynolds, please," he said quietly. "There are things about your husband's past you were never meant to see. He wanted to protect you from them." I leaned closer, my voice low and trembling. "He left me nothing. The least I deserve is the truth." The lawyer stared at me for a long time before exhaling. Then, almost as if he'd made a decision he'd regret, he whispered, "There's a key deposit box under his name. I shouldn't tell you this, but it's the only other thing he mentioned. A key deposit box." My heart skipped. "Where?" He scribbled an address on a slip of paper and slid it toward me. "Storage facility on Willow Street," he murmured. "But if you go there, do it alone." That night, I sat in my car outside the facility for nearly an hour. The rain came down in sheets, drumming against the windshield. Every part of me wanted to turn back, to let the lies stay buried, but I couldn't, not after everything. When I finally stepped inside, the fluorescent lights buzzed overhead. A clerk behind the counter looked up. "Can I help you?" he asked. I gave him my husband's name, my voice steady even though my hands trembled. He typed something on his computer, frowned slightly, then said, "Unit 47, been locked for years." I followed the narrow corridor until I reached it. My palms were sweating as I pulled the small key from my pocket. It slid perfectly into the lock. For a moment, I just stood there, my breath shallow. Then I turned it. The door creaked open, the sound echoing down the empty hall. Inside was a small metal trunk, old and dented, with my husband's initials carved faintly into the top. I dragged it into the light and knelt beside it. There was a second lock on the latch, but the same key fit again. When I lifted the lid, the scent of dust and paper hit me. Old letters, photographs, documents, all bundled neatly together. My fingers brushed over them like they were sacred relics. And then I saw it. At the very bottom, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a folded stack of papers. My heart thudded as I pulled them out. Across the top, in his unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "Last Will and Testament of Harold Reynolds." Another will. My hands began to shake so badly I almost dropped it. 1,000 thoughts flooded my head. Why had this been hidden? Why had another one been made? And what could be so dangerous that he couldn't trust anyone, not even his family, to know it existed? The truth was staring at me from those pages, just waiting to be read. But as I reached for them, a shadow crossed the hallway behind me. Footsteps, Someone else was there. And when I turned around, I realized this secret wasn't meant to stay buried quietly. Because what waited inside that storage locker wasn't just a secret. It was a confession that would burn everything I thought I knew to the ground. And when I opened that locker, I found a will. Another one, written entirely by hand. When I first unfolded the second will, my hands were trembling so badly that the paper almost slipped from my grasp. It was yellowed at the edges, creased like it had been folded and hidden for years. The handwriting was unmistakable. My husband's, shaky but strong enough to carry emotion in every line. I could still recognize the way he formed the letter R, that soft curve that dipped too low, the same way he wrote on birthday cards he used to leave on my bedside table. But what stopped my breath cold was the date. It was written on the same day as the official will, the one that had stripped me of everything. At first I thought it was some kind of mistake. Maybe he'd written an earlier draft, something he'd changed later. But as I began to read, the truth started to claw its way up from the paper, line by line. It wasn't a draft. It wasn't a mistake. It was his real will. And this one left everything to me. Every property, every account, every single share. The words blurred through my tears, but I forced myself to keep reading. In the final paragraph, he had written, "This is my true will. If it is replaced, then the betrayal came from within." Those words sank into me like a knife. From within. I could barely breathe. For weeks I had been haunted by the thought that he had turned against me, that he had chosen to erase me from our life's work. But now I saw the truth. The betrayal hadn't been his, it had been theirs. I sat on the cold floor of that storage unit, clutching those pages to my chest. My whole body was shaking, not just from grief anymore, but from rage. My children, my husband's brother, maybe even the lawyer. They had done this. They had rewritten history, stolen my husband's last act of love and replaced it with a lie. I felt the air around me grow heavier. I could almost hear his voice. Quiet, patient, the way he used to talk when something was wrong. "You always see what others miss," he used to tell me. And now, even in death, it was like he was guiding me toward the truth. I drove straight to the lawyer's office, gripping that will like a weapon. When he saw me, his face drained of color. He stammered something about having a meeting, but I didn't let him finish. I slammed the will onto his desk. "Explain this," I demanded. He stared at it for a long time, and when he finally spoke, his voice was a whisper. "Where did you find this?" "Doesn't matter where," I snapped. "It's his. His handwriting, his date. You told me there was only one will." He leaned back in his chair, rubbing his temples like a man about to confess to something that had been eating him alive. "You don't understand," he said quietly. They came to me. Your children. Your husband's brother. They said if I didn't file the new document, things would get ugly." My heart stopped. "My children?" He nodded, eyes downcast. "They said it was what your husband wanted, that you weren't well enough to handle the estate." I didn't know what to believe. But then when I hesitated, they threatened me, said they'd ruin my career, expose an old mistake. His voice broke then. "I swear I tried to protect you." I stared at him in disbelief. "Protect me? By destroying my life?" I said, my voice trembling. "You let them take everything." "Everything he built, everything we built." He reached across the desk, pleading. "You don't know how dangerous they are." But I did now. I left that office with the will clutched to my chest and my heart pounding like a drum. As I drove to the police station, I kept rehearsing what I'd say. I thought I finally had proof, that justice would finally see the light. But what happened next? I still can't believe it. When I walked into the station, they were already waiting. My daughter was there. My beautiful, sharp-tongued daughter who used to call me her hero. She was standing beside a police officer, holding a file in her hand. "Mom," she said, her voice calm, too calm, "you need to stop this. You're not well." I blinked, not understanding. "What are you talking about?" She sighed as if speaking to a child. "You've been under so much stress. The doctor said your memory's been failing, remember?" The officer's eyes softened in pity. My stomach dropped. "What doctor?" I asked. She held up the file. "These are your psychiatric records, Mom. You were diagnosed months ago. You've been refusing treatment." I could barely stand. "That's not true," I whispered. "That's not true." She placed a hand on my arm, soft, rehearsed. "Please, let's go home." "You're scaring people," I wanted to scream. to shake her, to make her remember who I was, the woman who raised her, who fought for her, who gave up her own dreams for her children. But when I looked into her eyes, I didn't see my daughter. I saw something cold, controlled, and I realized then she wasn't trying to save me. She was trying to erase me, just like they erased him. The police took my statement, but I could tell they didn't believe a word I said. The moment my daughter left, one of the officers gently asked if I had someone who could stay with me. That's when I knew they'd planted everything. They'd taken my credibility before I even stepped through the door. That night, I sat alone in the car outside my house, gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. I had the real will, yes, but what good was it if no one believed me? They'd turned me into the crazy widow, the grieving woman who'd lost her mind. But they'd underestimated me. They forgot who I was before I became mom, before I became the widow. I had built that house, that family, that life from nothing, and I wasn't about to let them bury me alive. I went back to the storage unit the next day. I knew there had to be more. My husband was meticulous. He never left anything unfinished. As I searched through the trunk again, I noticed something odd behind the boxes. A faint line on the wall, almost like a seam. I pressed against it. It gave slightly, hollow. My heart started racing. I grabbed a small crowbar from the corner and pried at the edge. The wood splintered, revealing a false panel. Behind it, wrapped in plastic, was a smaller metal box. My hands shook as I pulled it free and forced it open. Inside were stacks of documents. Bank statements, letters, notarized copies, all signed by my husband. They detailed everything. The fake accounts his brother had opened, the false signatures on the official will, even proof that the lawyer had been blackmailed. Every secret they'd buried, every lie they'd told, was right there. I felt my knees go weak. For the first time in months, I had something stronger than grief, power. But before I could even gather everything, I heard footsteps outside the unit. Slow, heavy, coming closer. I froze. The lights flickered once, then again. I could hear the sound of a door creaking open down the hallway. And that's when I knew they had found me. The people who had stolen my life, forged my past, and tried to destroy my mind were now here to silence me completely. When I broke open that wall, I found the documents that could destroy them all. But they found me first. The day of the trial felt like walking into the belly of a storm I had been running from my entire life. The courthouse was buzzing with whispers, and every eye turned when I entered. My heart thudded against my chest as if it were trying to escape. On one side of the room sat my husband's family, faces I once cooked for, celebrated with, trusted. On the other, an empty row where my children should have been. The space beside me felt colder than any winter. I clutched my bag tighter, feeling the hard edges of the evidence inside. The 2 wills, the recordings, the letters my husband had hidden. My truth was there, bound in paper and ink. But so was my heartbreak. When the judge called the session to order, the gavel hit like thunder. The air shifted. Every sound echoed too loud. The scrape of a chair, the shuffle of papers, the uneven breathing of the man who once managed our family's accounts. My lawyer began to speak, his voice steady and clear. Your Honor, this is not just a case about inheritance. This is a case about deception, coercion, and the theft of a woman's dignity. The first piece of evidence was played, a recording of the lawyer's confession. The entire courtroom leaned forward as his trembling voice filled the room. They threatened me. Her husband's brother said if I didn't replace the will, I'd lose everything. A gasp rippled through the rows. I looked at my daughter, who sat just a few feet away, her eyes locked on the floor. I had hoped, God, I had prayed, that she would see the truth now. But her expression didn't change. She looked as if she was fighting to hold something inside. When the forged signature was displayed on the screen, my breath caught. The side-by-side comparison left no doubt. The fake will, the real one, every stroke of the pen told a story of betrayal. Still, my in-laws sat stiffly, lips pressed tight, pretending none of it mattered. My husband's brother even had the audacity to smirk. That same smug smirk he wore the day of the will reading. I could almost hear his voice again. He warned us this would happen. The judge turned to the defense. Does the family have anything to say in their defense? My daughter stood up then. She looked smaller than I remembered, her voice shaking as she faced the court. She's making it all up, she said, pointing directly at me. My mother hasn't been the same since my father died. She's confused. Her words pierced deeper than any blade. I wanted to shout that I wasn't confused, that I had every receipt, every date, every truth in my hands, but my throat refused to open. I just stared at her, wondering how the girl I raised could twist herself into this version of a stranger. Then, the judge leaned forward and asked the one question that changed everything. "If your father didn't sign this," he said quietly, holding up the fake will, "then who did?" The silence that followed was so heavy it seemed to crush the air itself. My daughter froze. Her lips parted, but no words came. The judge waited. The room waited. And then she broke. Tears streamed down her face. "Uncle forced me," she whispered. "He said it was for our future. He said it was what Dad wanted." Gasps filled the courtroom. My husband's brother stood abruptly, shouting, "She's lying!" But no one listened anymore. The truth was spilling out faster than he could stop it. My daughter kept sobbing, repeating the same sentence. "I didn't want to do it, but he made me." The judge pounded his gavel for silence. My eyes stung with tears I couldn't hold back. I wanted to run to her, to hold her, to tell her it was over. But I couldn't move. I just sat there, hands trembling, torn between fury and heartbreak. What would you do if your own child admitted she helped destroy you, but only because someone else made her? Would you forgive her? Could you? The lawyer presented the final documents next. The proof from the storage unit, the bank records, the handwritten notes my husband left. Every piece lined up perfectly, like dominoes falling toward the truth. The defense had no words left. Even the judge's expression softened, shifting from skepticism to something like pity. By the time the verdict was read, I was numb. "The court finds in favor of the plaintiff," the judge said, his voice firm. "The handwritten will shall be recognized as the legal testament of the deceased." The room erupted. Reporters whispered. My in-laws' faces drained of color. The empire they had built on greed and deceit began to crumble before my eyes. The assets, the accounts, the properties, they were all coming back to me. I should have felt victorious. I should have felt relief. But as I turned to look at my daughter, she refused to meet my gaze. She sat there, head down, shaking. The son I had loved didn't even come. Not one message. Not a single word. I walked out of that courtroom with the papers clutched to my chest, surrounded by the noise of victory, but inside there was only silence. A silence that echoed all the way home. Winning the case hadn't given me back what I truly lost. Justice had come, yes, but love had not returned. Outside, cameras flashed. Reporters shouted questions I didn't answer. My lawyer guided me through the crowd, whispering congratulations. But his voice barely reached me. My thoughts were somewhere else. On the little girl who used to braid my hair, the son who used to fall asleep on my lap, the man who used to promise, no matter what happens, our family will stay together. That night, I sat at my kitchen table, surrounded by documents that once represented everything I'd built. The victory felt hollow. I had my husband's legacy back, but my family's love had turned to dust. I didn't know how to rebuild what was left, or if I even could. As I gathered the papers to lock them away, I heard a faint voice behind me. It was the lawyer from earlier, the same man whose trembling confession had turned the tide. He stood at my door, his face pale, eyes darting like a man carrying a secret too heavy for his soul. "I'm sorry to come unannounced," he said softly. "But I needed to tell you something before it's too late." I frowned. What more could there possibly be? He stepped closer, lowering his voice. "Your husband. He left something else. Something no one else knows about. He told me it was to be given to you after the trial. He said it would explain everything." My heart stopped mid-beat. "What do you mean, explain everything?" He glanced over his shoulder as if afraid someone might be listening. Then he whispered, "It's not about the money, Mrs. Grant. It's about the reason he wrote 2 wills in the first place." As the courtroom victory faded into the shadows of my mind, I realized this story wasn't over. Because if my husband had one last secret left for me, then everything I thought I knew about him, about us, was about to be tested again. And as the lawyer's words sank in, one thought kept circling in my mind like a storm I could no longer outrun. If he left something else behind? What truth was I still not ready to hear? When I walked out of that courthouse for the last time, the air felt heavier than it should have. People think that when justice is finally served, it feels like freedom. But in truth, it feels like silence. A silence so deep it swallows every sound around you. Reporters had stopped calling, neighbors had stopped whispering, and even my phone, once full of messages and false sympathies, stayed quiet. I thought I was done with the fight. I thought I had nothing left to lose. But I was wrong. Because that evening, as I was locking my gate, I saw him, the lawyer from my husband's estate, standing there holding a small sealed envelope. He looked older than he did in court, as if the truth we uncovered had taken something from him too. His voice was low, respectful. "He told me to give this to you," he said. But only after the trial was over. Only after everything had been settled. I stared at the envelope. The handwriting on it stopped my breath cold. It was his, my husband's. Every curve of every letter was burned into my memory. I hadn't seen that handwriting in years, and suddenly there it was, neat, steady, familiar. For a long moment, I couldn't move. My fingers trembled as I reached out and took it from him. "Do you know what's inside?" I asked quietly. The lawyer shook his head. He said it was private. He said it would be the last page. Then, without another word, he left. The sound of his footsteps faded down the street, and I stood there alone with that envelope pressed against my chest, afraid to open it, afraid of what it might undo inside me. I didn't sleep that night. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at it under the warm light of the lamp. My whole life had fit into papers lately. Court documents, bank statements, forged wills. But this was different. This was personal. It wasn't meant for lawyers or judges. It was meant for me. And that thought both comforted and terrified me. Finally, as dawn began to paint the sky pale gold, I tore it open. Inside was a single folded sheet, nothing else. My hands shook so much I almost dropped it. I took a deep breath and unfolded it. His handwriting again, steady, graceful, full of the man I once knew. It said, "If you're reading this, it means the truth has come to light. I leave you not just my fortune, but my peace. Forgive those who forgot your worth and live freely. You are my legacy." I read it once, then again, and again, until the words began to blur and my tears fell onto the page. For years I had fought for justice, clawed my way through shame, betrayal, and lies, just to prove that I was right. That I mattered. And yet here, in one single paragraph, he asked me for something I hadn't even considered. Forgiveness. What do you do when the person who hurt you the most asks you to forgive everyone else? How do you let go when the pain has become the only thing keeping you standing? I didn't have an answer. But I knew one thing. I couldn't live in that house anymore. Every room echoed with memories that no longer felt like home. So I sold it all. The estate, the cars, the business, every trace of the empire that had been built on betrayal. People called me foolish. They said I should keep it, rebuild my status, show them what I could become. But I didn't want any of it. Not the wealth. Not the titles. Not the ghosts. I wanted peace. The kind he had written about. The kind that doesn't come from victory, but from surrender. I found a small cottage by the sea. It wasn't much. White walls, wooden floors, a view of the waves that seemed endless. The first night there, I sat by the window and listened to the ocean breathe. For the first time in years, I didn't feel watched. I didn't feel judged. I just was. But peace doesn't erase love. It doesn't erase longing. Every Christmas, I still set 2 extra plates at my small kitchen table. One for the daughter who lied to save herself, and one for the son who never came. I know they won't knock on my door, but still I wait. Every December, I write them each a card. It's always the same message. You'll always have a home, if you ever remember who built it. I never sign it as mother. I just sign it with my name, because maybe they've forgotten even that by now. Some nights I imagine them opening those cards and staring at the handwriting, the same way I once stared at his. Maybe they cry. Maybe they don't, but I send them anyway. Because forgiveness, I've learned, isn't something you give once. It's something you keep giving, over and over, until it finally reaches the people who need it. Sometimes I walk along the shore with his letter in my pocket. The ink has faded a little now, from the salt in the air and the years passing quietly. But the words still feel alive. You are my legacy. I used to think that meant the money, the estate, the name. Now I understand what he really meant. I was his legacy not because of what I fought for, but because I survived. Because I found a way to live without bitterness eating through my soul. One afternoon, I met an old neighbor in town. She recognized me even though I tried to blend into the crowd. "You look peaceful," she said. I smiled, a real one this time. I am, I told her. It took me a long time to learn that peace isn't given. It's chosen. She didn't know what to say, so she just nodded and walked away. But inside, I felt something shift, a quiet acceptance that the story that once defined me no longer did. Years have passed since then. My hair has turned silver. My hands have softened. The anger that once burned inside me like fire has turned to warmth. Every morning I watch the sunrise from my porch and I whisper to the sea, "Thank you." Not for the pain, but for what it taught me, that justice is loud, but peace. Peace is quiet. Still, there are nights when I hear the echo of my daughter's voice in my dreams. "She's making it all up," she said once, and the memory cuts like glass. But then I remember my husband's final words, "Forgive those who forgot your worth," and I do. Every time the wound starts to reopen, I close it again, not with anger, but with love. Because I've learned that the only way to truly win is to stop fighting. Sometimes when the waves are gentle and the wind carries the scent of the sea through my window, I talk to him. I tell him I understand now, that the will wasn't about inheritance. It was a lesson, a gift, a way to set me free. And that's when I learned the truth. Freedom was the inheritance he wanted me to find.